Good day. Even as the Biden administration engages in what apparently are intensive discussions behind the scenes with the Russians, trying to set up a summit meeting between President Biden and President Putin in some unnamed and undisclosed third country in June, the US administration is simultaneously engaged in equally intense discussions with the Iranians in Vienna in talks brokered by the European Union, which are intended to find some way back for the United States into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, as I shall refer to it henceforth, the nuclear deal agreed by Barack Obama and the Iranians in the last years of Barack Obama's administration, whereby the Iranians agreed to impose limits on their nuclear enrichment program in return for the United States providing Iran with sanctions relief. Now, in order to discuss these negotiations, I'm afraid some background is necessary. Firstly, it's unquestionably the case that Iran, a country which has been at odds with the United States ever since the 1979 Iranian Revolution, has pursued an enrichment program, and that for a time in the 1990s and early 2000s, it took steps to try to conceal that program from outside scrutiny. Now, there is much debate as to what the purpose of this enrichment program is. The Iranians insist that it is intended for purely peaceful, civilian purposes, and they claim that the secrecy that was attached to it was because they knew that if they disclosed its existence, the Western powers would instantly say that it was intended to lead to the development of a nuclear bomb and would result in Iran being placed under pressure. The West, of course, having discovered and gained from the Iranians an admission as to the existence of this nuclear enrichment program, do insist that the program was actually, at some point at least, intended to lead to the development of a nuclear bomb. Well, I'm not here to arbitrate on the truth of this. I don't know the answer. I am going to venture a guess, which is that the Iranian denials that they had a nuclear weapons program in mind when they started this enrichment program seems to me somewhat unconvincing, notwithstanding the claims that the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei, has issued a fatwa saying that possession of nuclear weapons is somehow irreligious and prohibited by Islam. In my opinion, Iran probably did have some kind of nuclear weapons program underway in the 1990s, but I have always believed that it was never intended to be targeted either at the United States or Israel. Rather, I suspect that its purpose was to provide Iran with some breakout capability in case Iran's dangerous enemy, Saddam Hussein, in Iraq, who did have a nuclear weapons program in the 1980s, were to acquire a nuclear bomb at any possible time whilst he was still in power. After Saddam Hussein was overthrown in 2003, the Iranians, in my opinion, ceased to have a nuclear weapons program in any true sense, and I don't think they've ever had it since. However, a nuclear enrichment program does exist in Iran, and it does serve Iran's purposes in that it does again provide Iran with some insurance in case one of its Arab enemies, say Saudi Arabia, were to decide at any time to acquire a nuclear weapons capability of its own. Now, I've said all of this. I want to stress again, this is my own opinion. I can't verify it. I don't know what exactly took place within the higher reaches of the Iranian leadership. Probably only they know. Anyway, regardless of this, when news of this nuclear enrichment program leaked out, it caused understandable concern, and there was a great deal of pressure on the Obama administration, especially from Israel and Saudi Arabia, for action to be taken to bring it to a stop. Now, the Saudis and the Israelis, when they demanded action, undoubtedly had in mind military action. But President Obama, wisely in my opinion, decided that to take on a powerful country like Iran, with a population of 80 million people and a large industrial economy, would be extremely dangerous and very reckless, and instead he pursued the path of negotiation. And the result was the JCPOA, which was negotiated with great difficulty. The Iranians initially were reluctant to place caps on their nuclear enrichment capability, but they did want sanctions relief, with a whole cascade of sanctions imposed on them, not just by the United States, but by the United Nations Security Council also. In order, by the way, to get that sanctions relief, the Iranians actually escalated their nuclear enrichment program in the knowledge that the United States, that would put even greater pressure on the United States to come to the table. Anyway, after protracted and difficult discussions, brokered to a great extent by the European Union and Russia, an agreement was reached, and that agreement was the JCPOA. Now, the idea was that Iran would surrender much of its enriched nuclear material and would agree to caps on its nuclear enrichment programs in future, and would allow intrusive inspections of its nuclear facilities by the International Atomic Energy Agency. There's every indication that Iran has fully complied with that part of the agreement. Iran, however, in return, obtained from the United States a commitment that certain sanctions that had been imposed on Iran would be lifted, and the United States also agreed that the terms of the JCPOA would be time limited, that they would only continue for 10 years, and that after that, Iran would be at liberty to continue with nuclear enrichment as before. Barack Obama made the latter decision, in effect kicking the problem down the road, because he knew that in the limited time he was in office, he would not be able to negotiate a broader agreement with Iran. He took a decision and a gamble that if he was able to get a temporary limit or cap on Iran's nuclear enrichment program, then engagement between Iran and the United States would grow, and eventually the Iranians would, of their own volition, abandon this program to enrich nuclear fuel to the point where it might be considered a possible lead up to the obtainment of a nuclear weapon. Anyway, this agreement, the JCPOA, was, to put it mildly, controversial. It was controversial in the United States, where there is still a very strong head of steam against Iran, going all the way back to the events of the Iranian Revolution and to the storming of the American embassy during that revolution, and to the holding of diplomats, US diplomats, at that embassy hostage, an event which is burned in the memories of many Americans who remember it as a humiliation for the United States. and who, as a consequence, see Iran as an enemy and as a sponsor of international terrorism. So it was controversial in the United States, and it was also very controversial in Saudi Arabia and Israel also, especially in Israel, where it has become a talking point on the part of the Israeli leadership that Iran poses some sort of existential threat against Israel, and an existential threat which Israel is determined to counter, and which leads Israel to act in a way that will prevent Iran from ever acquiring a nuclear weapon at all, and with Israel being prepared to use military force in order to ensure that. Nonetheless, the JCPOA was agreed. Some of the sanctions were lifted, especially those which had been imposed by the UN Security Council, and there did appear for a time to be a de-escalation of tensions between Iran and the United States. Then along came Donald Trump, and he had radically different ideas. He saw the JCPOA, he noticed the compromises that Barack Obama made, and he pronounced the JCPOA a bad deal. He gave the impression that he thought he could negotiate a better one, and as a result, in 2017, he pulled the United States out of the JCPOA. He also imposed extremely strong sanctions on Iran, much stronger than the sanctions which had existed previously. Though it is important to stress that these are unilateral US sanctions. They are not sanctions imposed by the UN Security Council, and some states, notably China and Russia, do not recognize them and are not complying with them. Donald Trump not only objected to the terms of the JCPOA itself, the fact that it was time limited, leaving it open to Iran to resume nuclear enrichment on the same scale as before when the agreement expired. He also felt that an agreement would only make sense if it included restrictions on certain Iranian activities that the United States took objection to. Those activities were specifically Iran's very ambitious and very advanced ballistic missile program, and Iran's support for various Shia militia groups across the Middle East, and its active foreign policy in the Middle East, which the United States claims is destabilizing. Now, I have to say that this was, in my opinion, a demand by the United States too far. There was no conceivable way, in my opinion, that the Iranians would ever agree to bargain away their ballistic missile arsenal that they've spent so much time and effort developing, and which has now borne fruit in a variety of increasingly advanced and sophisticated missile systems, which gives Iran a powerful deterrent capability against its many enemies in the Middle East. But it is also inconceivable that the Iranians will ever sever their support for the various Shia militia groups in places like Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Doing so would be not just a betrayal by Iran of its Shia co-religionists in the Middle East, but it would also be a step whereby Iran would part with its major allies, which provide it strategic depth in the Middle East in the face of a possible attack either by Saudi Arabia or Israel. No Iranian leader would be able to survive in Iran were he to take that kind of step, either to part with those ballistic missiles or to cut off that support to Iranian militias. Were he to try to do so, it would provoke a very hostile reaction against that leader within Iran, and it would possibly undermine the stability of the Iranian regime itself. I don't think there is any possibility that it will happen. So, by making that demand, Donald Trump, perhaps not realizing the implications of what he was doing, wildly overreached himself and set himself and the United States into a state of confrontation with Iran. I think that Donald Trump gradually, towards the end of his presidency, began to understand that and was possibly trying to edge away from this extreme position that he had taken, and which he had been apparently urged to take as a result of bad advice he was getting, most probably from Saudi Arabia and Israel. But regardless, that was the position throughout the time that Donald Trump was president. However, the change of administration which took place at the start of this year might have suggested that policy would change. The Democrats had been extremely vocal in their criticism of Donald Trump's decision in 2017 to pull out of the JCPOA. There was much criticism of this action, and Joe Biden himself, on the campaign trail, gave everyone, including, of course, the Iranians, reason to believe that he intended, if he were elected and were to become president, to rejoin the JCPOA on essentially the same terms as those negotiated by Barack Obama. Well, Joe Biden did become president, and to many people's surprise and concern, that didn't happen. Instead, the new Biden-Harris administration appeared to make exactly the same demands or set of demands that Donald Trump had made whilst he was president. It too insisted that the JCPOA be broadened to include limits on Iran's ballistic missile program and on its support for Shia militia groups across the Middle East. Demands which, as I have said, are totally unacceptable to Iran. And as a result, the negotiations became deadlocked, and a great deal of goodwill that might have existed towards President Biden and his administration from Iran was dissipated and has been lost. Eventually, under great pressure from the Europeans, the United States did agree to resume these negotiations to go back into the JCPOA with Iran, and these negotiations have been taking place in Geneva. I suspect that one of the factors which has pushed the United States and the Biden-Harris administration towards agreeing to a resumption of those negotiations has been Iran's decision to steadily ramp up the level at which it enriches nuclear fuel. We are nowhere close to the point where Iran is enriching nuclear fuel at the level that would be necessary to create a nuclear weapon, and nor, it seems, does Iran have enough fuel to create a weapon. Nonetheless, the Iranians have been steadily taking steps in that direction, just as they did when Barack Obama was president, in order to put increasing pressure on the United States. And I suspect that that pressure has worked, and it is the reason why the United States now appears to be negotiating in earnest in Vienna to rejoin the JCPOA, and why a couple of weeks ago that unreasonable demand that Iran agreed to place restrictions on its ballistic missile programs and cut off aid to Shia militia groups, why those demands have been finally, and it seems conclusively, abandoned. Nonetheless, the negotiations have run into a host of difficulties, and one of them has been that the United States, the Biden-Harris administration, perhaps wishing to avoid outright humiliation by appearing to concede to Iranian demands, has insisted that Iran return to the levels of nuclear enrichment initially envisaged by the JCPOA in return for the United States re-entering the JCPOA and rescinding the new sanctions it has imposed. Needless to say, the Iranians have completely rejected that proposal. So far as they are concerned, all goodwill with the Biden-Harris administration having gone, they are not prepared to trust the United States with that sort of concession. Instead, they say that the United States must first agree to lift the sanctions and re-enter the JCPOA before Iran itself goes back to enriching uranium at the level that was initially agreed. And that was where we were until a few weeks ago, with the talks becoming deadlocked. Now, there is another factor which is looming over this issue, and that is that the JCPOA was controversial in the United States and with Saudi Arabia and Israel, but it was also controversial in Iran itself. Hardline, or shall I put it perhaps more appropriately, more nationalist and conservative elements within Iran, including within the Iranian power structure, were very unhappy that the Iranian government entered the JCPOA and agreed to restrictions on Iran's nuclear enrichment program. From their point of view, that enrichment program provides Iran with that insurance which safeguards it in case other countries in the Middle East start to threaten Iran with nuclear weapons. One of those countries is, of course, obviously Saudi Arabia, which has spoken in the past of it acquiring a nuclear weapons capability, possibly from Pakistan, with help from Pakistan, which is already a nuclear power. But the main one, obviously, is Israel, which already possesses an extensive, though undisclosed, arsenal of nuclear weapons. So, from the point of view of these more nationalist and conservative-minded people within Iran, abandoning Iran's nuclear enrichment program jeopardizes Iran's sovereignty and its national security and leaves Iran vulnerable to external pressure and threats from possibly better armed adversaries like Israel and the Saudis. And over the last few years, with the actions of the Trump administration pulling out of the JCPOA and ramping up sanctions pressure against Iran, and with the actions of the Biden-Harris administration at the start of this year, also imposing unacceptable demands on Iran for a time in return for the US returning to the JCPOA. As these measures have happened, these nationalist, conservative, more security-minded elements within Iran have become much stronger. Moreover, there are elections due in Iran in June, and it is widely predicted that a more conservative nationalist figure, perhaps one critical of the JCPOA, perhaps one unwilling to go along with the JCPOA, is likely to be elected president of Iran this June. In that case, this window to try to iron out the problems with the JCPOA may be very small. And what we have seen over the last few weeks is a concerted effort by certain powers that oppose the JCPOA to try to sabotage it. One of these efforts was a sabotage attack that was made on an Iranian nuclear facility at Natanz when a cyber attack was launched, which seems to have carried out a certain amount of damage and destruction at that facility, which has enraged the Iranian authorities. It is widely believed that the party behind that attack was Israel, with Israel a strong opponent of the JCPOA, which it regards as insufficient to deter Iran from pursuing its nuclear weapons ambitions in the future, the JCPOA being, as I said, time limited and also inadequate to restrain Iranian activities by allowing Iran to continue to support Shia militia groups across the Middle East and to possess ballistic missiles. So we had that attack on the facility, that cyber attack on that facility in Iran. And at the same time, we've also had this extraordinary leak of certain private comments made by Iranian Foreign Minister Zarif, in which Zarif was heard to make criticisms of the Iran's Revolutionary Guards Corps, this secondary military force, much more ideological than Iran's conventional military, which is the primary force in Iran responsible for internal security, and which is also the force which organizes Iran's support for the Shia militia groups across the Middle East. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps is widely believed to be one of the institutions in Iran which is most critical of the JCPOA. And Zarif is heard to say in these comments, which were recorded and then leaked, that the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, has inordinate amounts of influence in Iran, that it obstructs diplomatic activity, and that its former commander, General Soleimani, supposedly conspired to sabotage the negotiations leading to the JCPOA with Russia. All of this leak has been hugely controversial in Iran, and it has triggered massive criticism of Zarif from the more nationalist, conservative-minded forces there, which have been demanding his resignation. Indeed, it is quite possible that he will not survive this storm of criticism that these comments, this leak of his comments has elicited. Now, as to who exactly was the party responsible for this leak, no one seems to know, but the chances must be, since this is a leak of a conversation by Iran's foreign minister, that someone within the security services in Iran got hold of a transcript of Zarif's comments and leaked parts of it in order to discredit Zarif and quite possibly derail the negotiations in Geneva, in Vienna. I should say in Vienna, not Geneva. Well, we shall see what happens. At this precise moment in time, there are reports circulating, though they are not confirmed, that the Iranians and the Americans have been able to find common ground on several issues, and that they are edging ever more closely towards a position where the United States will indeed re-enter the JCPOA and will indeed lift sanctions on Iran's banking sector and its oil sector. That would be a radical concession by the United States and a major shift towards Iran. But we will see whether that does indeed happen. The time window is very small and it is closing fast. Mistrust has been sown by the foolish and indecisive actions of the Biden-Harris administration in its first few weeks, and where purposeful and focused action to take the United States back into the JCPOA at that time might have succeeded, that success cannot now be fully guaranteed. Once again, we have seen how indecision in Washington, indecision, by the way, which no one has fully explained, has put larger objectives of seeking some kind of deal with Iran in jeopardy. We will see over the next few weeks whether the US and Iran are able to overcome their common mistrust and find a way forward, or whether the opponents of the JCPOA in the United States, in Saudi Arabia and Israel, and in Iran itself will instead prevail. I should say that I think that this is going to be a key moment in the Middle East. If the United States is able to re-enter the JCPOA after having made various steps to walk away from it, but if it re-enters it on Iranian terms, then it will be very difficult for people in the Middle East to see it as anything other than a major concession and a major signal that the United States is indeed retreating from the Middle East. Iran will at that point be in the ascendant, and it will probably increase its influence in places like Iraq and possibly Syria and Lebanon also. The Saudis and the Israelis, by contrast, will be dismayed, and no doubt they will start to consider what steps they should take, possibly distancing themselves to some extent, not perhaps from the United States, but from this administration. The alternative, however, it seems to me, is worse. If the United States and Iran cannot agree a way forward and the JCPOA fails, then the situation is set up for a showdown at some point between the United States and Iran, with Iran almost certainly in that case pushing forward with its nuclear enrichment programs and forging at the same time ever closer ties with the new Eurasian powers, Russia and China, which are increasingly working together. At that point, some kind of military hostilities in the Middle East become more likely. The United States once more finds itself in a difficult position. It does so because of the way in which it has inserted itself to such a degree in the affairs of the Middle East, which in some ways it does not fully understand and which it is certainly unable to control. Trying to build long-term policies in the Middle East by an outside power like the United States has done is like trying to build a castle on a foundation of sand. The edifice might look imposing for a while, but eventually it crumbles. It seems to me that whatever happens over the next few weeks, we are going to see with these negotiations the beginning of that long retreat, or rather a further step in that long retreat of the United States from the Middle East, and that era which began in the early 1970s when the United States managed to establish itself as the prevailing, overwhelmingly dominant power across the Middle East and the country that essentially decided the course of decisions and events there. So this will be a step towards the end of an era. If so, however, if the United States manages to withdraw in an orderly way by agreeing to the JCPOA, despite the embarrassment and to some extent humiliation that it will suffer, that will at least provide a route for a dignified farewell. If, on the other hand, the negotiations fail and the JCPOA dies, then the outcome, the eventual outcome of an American retreat from the Middle East will probably happen still, but the sequence of events will be disorderly, chaotic, and perhaps violent. So the stakes are very high. Thank you for listening to me over this long video discussing this complex topic. Please come and watch and listen to further videos on this channel on various other topics too. And also remember to check out our main channel, The Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also check out Alex's channel. You will find links under this video. Please also check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, Library, Rumble, and especially Odyssey. Please also check us out on please also support us via Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. And remember, we accept payments and donations in all forms of currency, including the new electronic ones. Also check out our Discord server and come to our shop and buy the wonderful things you will find there. Last but not least, please check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel, and have a wonderful day.